In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And then he faced a class action lawsuit filed by the EPA. That is the angelic staff of the Heaven Environmental Protection Agency. But he hired a dedicated and engaged firm of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they fought this class action lawsuit. God was able to get the project approved, but the EPA wanted to know a timeline. And he said, I'll have the project completed in about 6 days. They sent him a certified letter saying to God that it would take 10 to 12 months to get the project finally approved and that he could complete it in 6 days. In a real sense, Stacey loves the EPA, but it doesn't mean anything about the Environmental Protection Agency. She loves effective government. As a matter of fact, Stacey is focused on making government better for the people of Georgia and the people of the 89th District. She loves principled leadership, and she is an example of principled leadership. As a legislator, as an accomplished entrepreneur, as a author, she is committed to thoughtful engagement and finding innovative solutions. And her accomplishments are many. She is the recipient of the 2012 John F. Kennedy New Frontier Award. She's also been featured by Emily's List and is a recipient of the 2014 Gabrielle Gifford Rising Star Award, and most recently the NAACP's Defining Leadership Series. She is a graduate of Spelman, the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Austin, and the Yale Law School. She is the first woman and the first person of color to lead in either chamber of the General Assembly. And since we're playing alphabet soup, if I had to define Stacey with one word, it would be the word courage. Maya Angelou says this about courage, that it is the most important of all virtues, for without courage you cannot practice any of the other virtues consistently. I am grateful that she is a friend to our work in the NAACP. She is a friend to voting rights in the state of Georgia. She's my personal friend. Would you welcome the leader in the House Democratic Caucus, Stacey Abrams.
That was a very frightening opening to his introduction. Thank you for having me. So I want to spend about 10 minutes talking about voting rights, because it'll take about that long to tell you all the things we're doing to you down at the Capitol. And then I'm going to stop and do Q&A. I think that might be more effective and more helpful. As Francis was kind enough to mention, voting rights for me, they're an essential part of who I am. I grew up in southern Mississippi. Last year we celebrated the anniversary of my father, who at the time was 15 years old, who at 50 years ago helped to integrate a voting precinct in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Now, this is someone who was not going to be allowed to vote, not because of race, but because of age. But he believed it to be so essential to who he wanted to be as a person that he was arrested along with a number of other folks in Hattiesburg, making that happen. And 50 years later, he's rabble-rousing still in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. There are some shenanigans happening there, and he and my mother, they've been together since they were 15. My mom is usually responsible for bail. But as we have discovered, she's also the person who's egging him on very quietly. So I'd like to think I come by this all honestly. Down at the Capitol this year, we have faced one very sharp attack on voting rights. With our fingers crossed, we were very pleased to see that HB 194 did not come out of the legislature, did not come out of the House. That was not by accident. It was a combination of external pressure, but also internal machination. But these things always, you wait until 11:59 on day 40 to see what will happen. The challenge that was posed by 194, if you're not familiar with the bill, it is a bill that will cut early voting down to 10 days and only allow you either a Saturday or a Sunday. In the Rules Committee, when we asked the author about the genesis of the bill, unlike a bill that was actually passed in a very bipartisan fashion a few years before, which was premised on the fact that you had a number of cities and counties that literally were spending up to $78 per vote because Georgia law requires that for every day of early voting, you have 3 people on staff, and you had cities that had fewer than 500 people and only 1 person who voted the entire 45-day history. And so you had a lot of smaller communities that really were being crushed by the cost, and no one was using the service. 21 days was the national average, and so it seemed economically reasonable to make that decision, given the number of counties and cities that we have in the state of Georgia, more than 500 cities, more than 150, or 159 counties, more than 500 cities. But Chairman Hamilton, in all honesty, said that the reason for 194 was that he thought it made sense. There was no economic data, there was no analysis of usage. In fact, he didn't think that was necessary, he just thought it made sense. We did not think it made sense, and so we are pleased that actually in a very bipartisan fashion, this bill was not allowed to move out. Now, we also should remember that 2016 is an election year, and magic always happens on the evil side, and so, wizards may arise and that bill may move, so let's not get too comfortable. But for now, that is not something we're fighting. On the other side, though, it is critical, I believe, to be proactive about these things. It's not sufficient to simply play defense, to fight what's coming. We have to offer alternatives. And so each year, the House Democratic Caucus has offered a slate of proactive, pro-voter bills. This year, HB 26 is a bill that we think is absolutely common sense. It would allow you to vote in any precinct in your county. We know you can do it because we have early voting. We know it works. And so we believe that on election day, if you live in Gwinnett County, you should not have to wonder if 316 is going to move fast enough for you to cast your ballot. We believe that any voter should be able to vote in any precinct in their county. That's HB 26. HB 130 is timely process. This past year, I had some familiarity with the lack of timely process from the Secretary of State's office when it comes to submitting voter applications. And we found that in our writ of mandamus, when we brought our action against the Secretary of State to force processing, what the judge properly noted was that while a citizen who applies to vote and is told their application is pending has 40 days to respond, the government has no obligation to tell them anything prior to election day. So you can submit your application in April, and as long as they respond to you by the day of the election, that under Georgia law is sufficient. We believe that is insufficient, and so we have offered legislation that would put a 45-day shot clock on it. That once your application goes in, there's 45 days to respond from the Secretary of State or from the county. Georgia is one of the handful of states that does not have an actual obligation on the part of the elections official to tell you that there's a problem. And indeed, with the New Georgia Project, we continue to gather information from voters who say we got our precinct card the day after the election. We got our letter saying we were pending status the week after the election. I went to vote with my precinct card, but they don't have a record of it because it was sent out 2 days before. And those are problems that are solvable problems when we think about our voting patterns. The third bill that we've offered is the permanent portable registration. In Georgia, when you move, you have to re-register. Most people don't know it, and they find out when they go to vote and then discover that they're not listed, and thus they have to file a provisional ballot if they're allowed to do that. HB 146 would make it permanent. Once you're registered in Georgia, you're registered in Georgia. No matter where you live, you take your registration with you. There's no reason that shouldn't happen. If Oregon can register everyone tomorrow, we should be at least able to tell you that if you move from Fulton County to DeKalb County, you don't have to go back and re-register. These are 3 bills that have gotten almost no hearings. I think we got 1 hearing on 1 bill, but we need public pressure. And these are bills that will survive until sine die in 2016. So between now and then, we encourage everyone to lift up these bills. These are not partisan issues. It's hard if you live in Blue Ridge. If you decide you're going to move from Rabun County to Stevens County or to Thomas County, you've got a problem. No one should be denied the right to vote because of location or because we just don't feel like doing our jobs. And so I encourage everyone to push hard for those bills to move. And with that, I'm going to stop and let you ask me any questions that you have. Or I can just keep talking.
I have a question about, we mentioned the problems that you experienced last election season. One of the things that I was curious about, how much do you think an effect that the Interstate CrossCheck program had with the difficulties that you had with the missing voter registration?
We don't think those two things are connected, but we do think that those are separate problems we need to pay attention to. So Interstate CrossCheck, if you heard about this, it's the miracle child of Chris Kobach, of Kansas fame. He doesn't like immigrants or voters or people, as I can tell. He has the system that tells you how many people are legally voting in your community based on some alchemy that no one can really figure out. And it's so bad that, for example, the Republican Secretary of State of Washington State pulled out of the program. She said the information, the data was so flawed, she could not in good conscience use this. A number of Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State who were using the system have pulled out. The Pew Research Center has called it a failure in very nice words, nicer words than I will use. But what it does is it looks at your address, and if you were ever registered somewhere else, and it says that you must be trying to vote in 2 different places if you happen to move. And so, for example, my older sister, who is a college professor in Kentucky, is listed in the CrossCheck system as an illegal voter because she left 7 years ago, and because she was registered in Fulton County and is now registered in Franklin County, they are accusing her in the CrossCheck system of being an unlawful voter who's trying to commit fraud. That's not what she's doing, she's teaching. But the problem with the system, the deeper problem, is that the system uses a last name match, which if you are a person of color, is almost guaranteed to capture you. If you are a person of Asian descent, the numbers are astronomical of people who are accused and are therefore in certain states purged based on that information. The Secretary of State says that he has not used it for purging purposes, he just uses it for informational purposes. We've yet to ascertain what those informational purposes are, but we do not believe it's being used for purging. The issue that we faced on the New Georgia project side were twofold. One, there was a directive issued by the Secretary of State, unbeknownst to us, that essentially did not allow the processing of new voter applications from the primary in May to the runoff in July. If you are turning in 25, 50, 30 applications, then yes, if you start processing them in July 22nd, July 23rd, that might not be a problem. If you've gotten 10,000 or 20,000 or 80,000 applications, that could clog the system. We also have found that there is not a great deal of uniformity in how pending is determined, and the NAACP has had incredible experience with this as well. So it wasn't endemic to us. We simply became more aware of it because of the sheer volume of applications we were turning in. But other groups like the NAACP have all experienced the challenges. But we believe that the issues with our applications are much more endemic to the nature of processing by the Secretary of State and not to the CrossCheck system. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to ask Tran Nguyen to talk about the bill that was passed in Virginia with voter ID to mitigate the effect of voter ID.
Oh.
Yeah.
To talk about it again?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, if she was-
I wasn't here.
Oh, you weren't there. Oh, okay. Yeah, so in Virginia, we do have a photo ID law that was passed that wasn't as restrictive as some of the other states. And so we had set out to work with both the Republican and Democratic administrations to basically, as the state board of elections was promulgating rules and regulations, to mitigate as much as possible the effects of Virginia's photo ID law. And so essentially what a voter has to do now, if they don't have an ID, is to just go into any registrar's office, provide their name, address, and the last 4 digits of their social, just to confirm that they're a registered voter, and no questions asked, will be have their picture taken and have an ID issued. And so, I mean, it's a great set of rules. I think as ID is, gonna be here to stay in some places, and as other states are looking at it, we're hopeful that the Virginia photo ID, to the extent that states have it, the Virginia photo ID rules are sort of the gold standard for how to do this, so that voters actually aren't impacted.
With the new 45-day proposed bill that you guys are implementing, you want to implement, what happens if an election falls within that 45-day time frame? Because I know a lot of times when elections come up, people give a push to get people registered, and sometimes that's within that 45 days. So what you guys have do you want to implement to protect those individuals?
So state law requires that voter registration ends 30 days before an election. And so you really have a 2-week period that is a gap. We can certainly look at that. We used 45 days because that was the national standard that we found. But I think you raise a very valid point. The other challenge is that, and this goes to the larger issue of voter registration drives, and I'm not sure how much you all have talked about this, so if I'm repeating statistics that you have, please forgive me. In the state of Georgia, the New Georgia Project, the onus of it came about because in the state of Georgia in 2014, there were 833,000 unregistered African American, Latino, and Asian voters of color. So these are citizens living in Georgia who had not registered to vote. They are typically younger, and they are typically in the lower socioeconomic bandwidth. The question that always comes up is, why do you need to do a voter registration drive? Why don't they register themselves? Well, in Georgia, post-2010, about 1.4 million people have self-registered. Of that, that's about 500,000 African Americans who register themselves. But typically, people register themselves if they are in the middle or upper tier of the economic bandwidth. If you are not in those 2 tiers, you are much more likely to register if someone comes to ask you. And there are 3 reasons why. These are voters who are deeply cynical about government. They are aware. So these are not apathetic people, and these are not ignorant people, despite some of the popular conceptions. They are very aware, but they don't believe government works because, well, they've lived in generations of poverty, and they've seen people get elected who've done nothing about it. And so they're deeply cynical about the effect of voting and the effect of registering to vote. But secondly, there's a deep concern about what registration actually looks like. When we started the project, we did a focus group in Albany and in Atlanta. We did African American and Latino, and without exception, when we would show people what the form looked like, it was eye-opening. People were so convinced that it was going to be a 2 or 3 or 5-page form that they would have to give information they didn't possess. They didn't realize how easy it was because no one's ever asked. They also are afraid of voting. There's a lot of fear because all you hear about voting for a great deal of that population is about hanging chads and bad systems and people lying in long lines. Well, if you've never voted, you don't really trust voting. You've got maybe an hour of your day that you can spend on this, if that much. How likely are you to give that time to something you don't trust and you don't understand? They don't register because they don't plan to vote because they don't think it'll work. And so one of the things we did with the New Georgia Project is we actually invested in teaching people how to vote. We made sure not only that we gave them access to the application, but we actually did a video that was viewed more than 80,000 times where we had a little kid explaining the process of voting. 80,000 views on YouTube of a video about voting. That came about because people were so hungry for information that to understand that all you have to do is stick this form, stick this card in. They didn't want to be the one standing in line holding up people behind them. They didn't want to be the reason that people got angry because they didn't understand what they were doing. And in a lot of, especially our rural counties, they didn't understand that it was a secret ballot. They were afraid that if they voted, the sheriff would know how they voted and would come after them, that somebody would be able to tell their boss, and they would lose their jobs. And this is not something just sprang out of their imagination, because often that's the information communicated to them by those who are trying to dissuade them from voting. And so you're dealing with a population that is disconnected, disaffected, and disenfranchised. And so our opportunity and our obligation with voter registration drives is to go to the door and explain all of this. So for these drives, we did 619,000 door knocks and contacts to yield 86,000 actual applications, 46,000 who were actually processed and made it onto the rolls by Election Day. With all of that work, the average turnout among voters who registered through registration drives nationally is 20%. So it takes all of that work to get a 20% yield. Because again, you're dealing with layers and layers of economic, socioeconomic, ethnic, and just institutionalized issues that make people unlikely to actually engage in the act of voting. And if you are a naturalized citizen in Georgia, God help you. It's nearly impossible to get through the process.
It is.
Okay, I'll get off of that soapbox and let somebody else ask me a question.
I have a two-pronged issue on the same issue about the bills that you were talking about. One, if you could speak to possibly maybe not the traditional groups that you've reached out to that would possibly support these very common sense, open voting bills that you're talking about. And also what we might be interested in this room, where we can find out enough information to be helpful, and what you would recommend for any of us who want to be helpful, what we can do.
Absolutely, thank you. So the first part of this is that we reach out to everyone. One thing that we do in the House Democratic Caucus, we introduce our legislative agenda at the very beginning of the session, and then we hold our own hearings, because it's not always likely that we're going to get a hearing from the majority. So we have our own set of hearings, and we did those in January and start of February. We invite everyone. We also provide information to all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle about the bills. I will tell you that some of our greatest successes have happened because of organizing work that we do with the Tea Party. And so, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I don't discount any set of opportunities to get things done. And so I encourage everyone to de-politicize this issue. This is not a Democratic or Republican issue, because the communities that are most affected are actually, they tend to be veterans and the elderly. If you talk about it in with those two metrics, you are much more likely to get people to be engaged and invested. And if you talk about it in the context of what's happening in their community, 2 years ago we were able to stop a fairly aggressively bad bill, because we were able to show that this wasn't an Atlanta issue, this was a South Georgia issue. And when you can do that, when you can take it out of Atlanta, when you can take out the racial elements, when you can depoliticize it, you can build, I think, really interesting coalitions. But if you want to know more about the bills, go to www.gahousedems.com. gahousedems.com. We keep a list of all of our bills. We also have a handy-dandy guide to lobbying the House of Representatives about these bills and how to get them through. And if you reach out to anyone on our staff, we will help you do whatever you want to help us get it done. But really what will move these bills are people talking about them and asking their legislators why you're not passing this bill. Kristen.
I have a question about redistricting. What do you think would be the smartest opportunity for us here in Georgia to affect, to have a better redistricting outcome, short of taking back the House and Senate?
A time machine.
You can include taking back the House and Senate.
Here's the challenge. Georgia, because we had so many years of Democratic rule, 2011 was the first year Republicans had an opportunity to draw the maps. And then we lost Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which means we have lost the only lever that kept them in check, and it didn't do that great a job in 2011, is now gone. The way the maps are drawn in the House, for example, 124 Republican districts were drawn by eliminating 7 white women. They literally drew the lines to eliminate white women Democrats. And we tried to argue that was a racial attack, but unfortunately the Justice Department didn't agree with us. They also packed to the limit. There's a threshold. They got right on that to pack those districts. We were able to claw back 4 of the 124 districts they allocated to themselves, and then an independent was elected into the one of the districts. So there's 119 Republicans, 60 Democrats, and 1 independent. That both of us try to convince really is just confused about his independence and wants to be with one of us. But the reality is that politicians want to keep their jobs. The best way to keep your job is to draw your safest district possible, and the best way to keep power in a state with such rapidly changing demographics is to do your level best not to have any of those demographics in your district. And so that's what's happening now. The opportunity that will arise in 2021 is that they're running out of room. Until we go into Alabama or Tennessee, you're going to have to start adding more. And that's one of the reasons we actually have a chance to take back the House, and maybe partisan for a moment. The opportunity that exists for the Democratic caucus is that in order to draw so many seats, they actually had to draw incredibly thin margins for themselves. And in counties like Douglas County and Henry County, places like Newton County, and then in South Georgia, you've got increasingly thin margins where demography is just outstripping ideology. That's going to help, but the only way to guarantee a change in those maps is to shift the political balance of power to make it ineffective to not recognize this community. So the very long winding way I've come to this answer is that if you want it to be better, people have to demand better. People have to be willing to say in Gwinnett County, it is inexcusable for a county that is a majority minority county to have a majority white representation. 17 of those districts are not represented by a person of color. I think it's 17 out of 21 districts. And this is a majority minority county. Until the community starts to demand representation, but the challenge is, and this is the tricky part, and it's hard, it's anathema for me to say this, I do not believe that you have to look like me to represent me. And I don't want us to get into the habit of making that the way we talk about this, because that's how we got into this mess in the first place. And so we've got to be very careful about demanding racial parity in terms of representation and more racial awareness in the way we think about this. Because there are metrics within communities that should be represented and that should be identified, and you are more likely to understand the needs of a community if you've had those shared experiences, and that is a critical piece. But that cannot be the way we draw our maps going forward, because the other challenge Georgia faces is that we are going to be a majority minority county sometime between 2025 and 2060, depending on who doesn't like us that day. But if we haven't figured this out, we are going to have the most factionalized politics the South has ever seen. Because we are not going to be a black and white state. We're going to be a black and white and brown and yellow and red and whatever other hue we can come up with. And if we haven't figured out how to push for our needs without making it overtly and exclusively about race, we will not be able to fix our redistricting.
Wouldn't that make the argument for an independent commission over allowing?
Oh, absolutely. An independent commission solves a lot of problems, but we will never do it. Georgia has a very, very favorable system for politicians, and we are incredibly unlikely to give away our own power. And unlike the states that have independent commissions, most of those states also allow for referenda by the citizens. We don't let you tell us stuff. I take one more question. Yes.
Looking down the road through next year, what other efforts would you predict might come down the pike to suppress voting, like shrinking early voting?
I mean, I will say this, the leadership in the House and Senate and in the governor's mansion, I wouldn't say they've been the friendliest, but they also haven't been as hostile as some of our neighbors. We have not seen the legislation like Texas, you have to stand on one toe and turn and circle 3 times. We're not Florida, we're not North Carolina yet. And I think part of that is due in no small measure to the strength of our civil rights movement, to the strength of groups like the NAACP and the People's Agenda, but also the fact that we are a strong business community, and our business community is very actively engaged in our civic politics. And so we've shied away from being as egregious as we could be. Now, that can change, but that, I think, is the saving grace that we have. We can certainly get worse. We have no limits on how stupid we can become. But we have eschewed that so far, and I'm hopeful we'll continue to do so. Because the reality is, no matter how you feel about last year's elections, voter suppression is a good turnout tool. And I think they've seen that happen, especially in Ohio, in Florida. And so I think in a presidential year, it is unlikely that you will see something as strident as has happened in other states, because unlike an off-year election, in a presidential year election, a lot more people will pay attention and a lot more people will be angry and react to it. And so I'm hopeful that that will serve as a stopgap. Okay. Well, thank you all for having me, and I appreciate it.